Hello and welcome to KQED's Teach Do Now webinar in partnership with Educator Innovator. It's Monday, July 28th, and today we'll be talking about engaging young people in civic discourse and community engagement. I'm your host, Paul O. of the National Writing Project, filling in for Matt Williams of KQED, and I'm thrilled to be talking with such amazing guests, and that is not hyperbole. I actually believe that is absolutely true. They are amazing. Before I introduce everyone, I'd like to take a second to explain this webinar in relation to the Teach Do Now course and what you should expect during the week ahead. So for those of you who are not familiar with Teach Do Now, it's an online course open to anyone, but targeted for teachers who are interested in learning how to integrate social media and 21st century learning approaches to their teaching practice. This course is designed to present these ideas using tools like Twitter and Google+ so that participants can experience their learning in action. During the 6 weeks of Teach Do Now, we'll present a framework for learning where weekly topics are introduced through our Monday webinars, such as this one. Participants are then encouraged to participate with questions and comments during the webinar. You can even watch the webinar archive video later in the week and share comments. You can also go deeper into conversation through our weekly Do Now prompts, where we provide useful resources to help steer the remainder of the weekly conversation, which are on the Teach Do Now blog. Unlike traditional face-to-face courses or even many online courses, this one is happening at any time and anywhere for you, the participant, to share ideas, reply to others, ask questions, and be present when the time is right for you. We all come to this course with vastly different backgrounds and knowledge of social media, either personally or professionally, and we want this environment to embrace the diversity of our participants' knowledge. Just remember to use the hashtag TeachDoNow so people can see your comments. And a great way to see all of the comments is on the tag board at tagboard.com/teachdonow, which pulls comments from Twitter and Google+. All the resources for discussion can be found on the Teach Do Now blog at www.kqed.org/teachdonow. Great. And so before I introduce our guests, I should just say that I am fighting a little bit of a cold, so if I sound raspy, please forgive me. Today our guests are Shawn McCusker, Leah Clapman, Diana Laufenberg, Chris Sloan, and Ellen Middaugh. And I'd like to give them a chance to briefly introduce themselves. So Chris, why don't you start?
Hi, my name is Chris Sloan. I teach English and Media, high school English and Media at Judge Memorial in Salt Lake City, Utah.
Great, thanks Chris. Diana?
And my name is Diana Laufenberg, and I taught for 16 years, all grades 7 through 12 in the social studies area, most recently at the Science Leadership Academy, and now work with the community there to extend inquiry-driven, project-based, one-to-one learning more broadly in the educational world.
Great, thanks Diana. Ellen?
Hi, Ellen Middaugh. I am a research director with the Educating for Democracy in the Digital Age project, so I see a lot of teaching and work with teachers who are integrating digital literacies into high school core curriculum to support civic engagement.
Great, thanks. Leah?
Hi, I'm Leah Clapman. I'm the managing editor for education at the PBS Newshour, where we publish Newshour Extra for teachers and student reporting labs in which we involve students and teachers around the country in producing news packages for our national platform.
Great, thanks. And Shawn?
Hi, I'm Shawn McCusker. I'm a social studies teacher at Libertyville High School in Libertyville, Illinois. I'm also an online organizer for many educator communities on Twitter and other social media.
Great. So just a couple more bits of information for our audience. So to those watching live right now, we welcome your comments via the Teach Do Now hashtag on Twitter, as I said, or the Google Plus page. And Randy Depew, who's also in this Hangout, hiding behind the incandescent bulb, will be monitoring for those questions, and we'll be posting them here in the Hangout for us to respond to. As well, in the chat on the Educator Innovator webinar page, you can post questions, and Randy will pick up on those too and pose them to the panel here, and as time permits, we will definitely get to them. So this week we are launching a conversation about civic discourse and community engagement for learners. So we have a number of educators here in the Hangout, and I wanted to pose to you all, what changes in students and the culture of your learning environments have you witnessed over the past several years in thinking about this notion of how we would frame civic discourse and community engagement?
Well, I guess what I would say is it's something that's really obvious is just how connected they are. Not only in class they're connected, which is a development more, I think, in the last couple of years, where it's actually becoming more accepted in a lot of education that the students are connected to outside resources during class. So they've been connected for at least the last 15 years anyway. But I would say that the classrooms are more open now, for better and worse, but usually better.
I would...
Go ahead.
Oh, okay, I was going to say that the advent of video as a viable way to present information has really affected our work, because we're much more able to present, from my perspective, Newshour videos as a resource, but also have the students work in the video medium and be able to transfer files and be able to have the software, and teachers are starting to really kind of accept video editing and the ability to play with that kind of media as a way of the students learning and being able to assess the products that they make. I know there are lots of broadband issues that continue, and we deal with them all the time in terms of when the students can participate, especially when we're using a video-heavy platform like we experimented with Meograph earlier in the year, which was great, but again, it's broadband intensive, so I think that that's just coming into its own right now, is the ability for the students to use video and those video platforms to their full potential.
I'd like to add to that I think that we see a lot more now of students bringing content into the classroom and topics for discussion, because they're so connected more broadly to what's going on in the world. It used to be a little bit more within at least my or other teachers' control, the topics that we discuss. I think that when I bring up a concept now, students are likely to connect it to other things that they're experiencing through social media, which I think is positive, but also hard for the teacher, because it means you need to be aware more broadly of things that are going on, which is good. And I think that also puts a little bit more control of what we discuss in the hands of the students, which I think is just another positive outcome.
And then what I will add to that is kind of an interesting moment is that I was long-term subbing last year in a classroom in Flagstaff, 7th graders, and many of them were just kind of getting cell phones and doing that whole figure out the world of information thing. And many of them, after we started discussing current events a lot, started following it themselves on their phone and really wanting to kind of show that they were actively participating on their own, of their own choosing, in the world of ideas and current events. And that's certainly not the world I stepped into in '97 when I stepped into my classroom, but just really both that they're interested and engaged in it, and then kind of taking initiative. That's been really interesting.
That's great. And I want to pick up on one thing that was discussed here. This notion that I think Leah started talking about, this idea of production-centered. Would someone like to talk about that? Because it does seem to me that the affordances of the tools of the web, the affordances of digital media, make it possible for young people to be the creators of the media that they then use their social networks to push out.
I can speak somewhat to this. So one of the things that's interesting is I think when we think about discourse and dialogue, when I started doing this work and examining what's happening in the classroom 10 or 15 years ago, they had things like discussion circles and debates, And when we try and study young people's participation in civic dialogue, it's often asking, are you having conversations? And what we see is participation in public discourse looks pretty different nowadays. So it could be pushing out your own content, any variety of video, infographics, that kind of thing, or sort of commenting on other people's content, or even the simple like. So you have all of this range of activities for young people to sort of weigh in with their opinion or express it that might not look like a sustained 1 hour face-to-face conversation. So thinking about how to participate meaningfully in that has been, I feel like that's changed quite a bit.
And I wondered, Ellen, if you could talk just a little bit about, so is this this is essentially like your area of research focus. Can you tell us what the research is saying about these notions of civic discourse?
Yeah, so in terms of discussion, this is more of a challenge for research, is that when we ask students if they engage in discussion online, they tend to say no about politics compared to face-to-face. But when we ask, you know, have you forwarded information, you see much higher numbers. So just thinking about how to ask the question. The other thing we're seeing, which I think maybe we'll get into a little bit later, is just that with the rise of participatory media, there's a lot more opportunities for young people to be part of the discussion, but the norms of those environments are sort of evolving and changing, so figuring out what a productive conversation looks like is something we're still figuring out. So we see that the more young people participate in participatory media, they're also more likely to see conflict and outrage language, so there's a lot to think about in terms of the conversation.
Great, thanks, Ellen. And I believe, Diana, in your experiences, do you have, I mean, you must have, in your years of teaching, examples of this kind of work that you could share with us?
So one of the most kind of directly engage in is actually kind of blending that moment of media, but also of their own ability to go and capture the world around them as they see it. And so one of the things that I did every year with the kids was have them go out to the polls on Election Day and engage a conversation with a voter. And the whole story was to bring back that conversation to the class. And so you'd have, you know, 100 kids somewhere in Philadelphia searching out this conversation. And I can definitely post some examples of this, but we would get, I mean, it would run the gamut. So some kids would just choose to use, just type in a transcript of the conversation. Some would do audio and some would do video, and some would go home and do some pretty elaborate video editing because, you know, and over the years they'd watch the previous year and want to kind of one-up the last year's best version of it. And I said to the kids one day, I told you this is kind of just raw footage. I don't need you to do this whole production. And they said, you know, basically, I don't put stuff out like that anymore. Like, I don't just push any old video out with my name on it. You know, if my work's going online, this is the way it looks, and this is how I do things. And you know, and they would engage in these really amazing conversations with people in their community that they normally would have no reason to interact with. And watching the average voter talk to a 16, 17-year-old about, you know, why they were voting and what were the big issues to them that day, and really engaging in a pretty civil and an interesting conversation. I could just, you know, you can just tell that the adults are both like, what's the catch? You know, you're a kid in Philly being really kind and interested, and then them kind of buying into the whole thing, and the kids being kind of taken with the fact that, you know, one kid said to me, you know, people in Philly aren't on their face incredibly like nice. Like some people just don't want to talk to you, and what do I do? And I said, oh, the only people that want to talk to you about this are at the polls, so it's pretty safe that the people showing up want to speak to you. And they found that that was really refreshing, that there was a place where they could go and have this conversation pretty safely and interesting and all that. But I can post some of those examples in the chat.
Diana, that's really interesting that we experienced the same thing. So in 2008, the Newshour put on a project. It was with YouTube called Video Your Vote. And we tried to get first-time voters to go and video their vote. You know, we told them there are laws that probably affect this. Look up in your state the polling laws about access and what you can tape and what you can't. Those have always been great learning experience too. And then this year we did a project, in 2012 we did a project called Listen to Me. So we asked the students to go out into their communities and tape answers to the question, basically, what is an issue that you feel like political candidates are missing? And so what we do is we take these answers that the students are producing, and in our student reporting labs, the curriculum focuses on both editorial skills, editorial ethics, journalism ethics, but then also a real deep focus on production values. And so the students submit their video responses, and then we craft a piece for the Newshour. So that's really inspiring to the students to have the access, because we get, Newshour broadcast has 1 million viewers every night. So we're always telling students, if you can do this, if you can get video quality that work on broadcast, if you can sift through your answers, only submit to us the really good stuff, because we're not going to have time to go through, your hours of footage. You have to decide what's going to make a difference to an audience and what's not. And then once it comes to us, we will choose, the answers and the videos that are really compelling, craft something that'll go on the Newshour. And that's so inspiring for the kids. They actually go out and they, tweet it and they put it on Facebook, and it's a really great way to give students an assignment that has an authentic audience, which is Newshour's audience, whether online or broadcast, but also with a purpose. Know why they're doing it, what they're doing, why they're doing it, and then they can see the results of their efforts.
I just wanted to add, there's a couple of things that resonated with me, and the first one was when Diana and Leah too said the public nature of this discourse creates a different level of quality and an urgency that it's the direction of the urgency. As a teacher, you can put pressure and kind of nudge your students, but in that, I feel like something's lost. Like the authenticity of a real audience urges them on because they're putting their product out there. And like Diana said, my students see it as their brand. My work is at this quality, and it's not for you, Mr. McCusker. It's because I present myself in this way. But, I mean, and that's in what we create, but that's also in the statements that we make. When my students, for the election with my students, we started having a conversation using some more private discussion formats like Today's Meet, where they can have a chat with other students. We had 95% of my classes show up for an optional discussion about the presidential debates. And then that evolved into students asking, can my parents participate? And so we had parents eager to participate in our discussion. That eventually evolved into us putting our comments out on Twitter. And what we quickly learned is that when you're going to frame a public statement, you have to be aware of the implications, what it means, the place of those statements within the political world that we live in, because it's going to breed a reaction. And somebody had mentioned that we're going to experience people's reactions to that. So the public nature forces students to both think ahead, frame their thoughts very clearly, and they can't be cavalier or casual in the way they just throw out an idea. And I like that construction of ideas.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about that public nature too, because a few years ago, well, maybe it was just last year, can't remember, my students put together this thing on gun control, and they put a YouTube video together where they aired all their views, and it was packaged as a letter to elected officials, because basically, we all know how unproductive discourse is, especially political discourse around issues like gun control. So these students put together this thing that represented all their views. So there was a hunter, there was kids who wanted to outlaw guns and that kind of thing. So they were just saying, politicians, if we can come up with some things and talk together, maybe you should too. And the interesting thing that happened on YouTube was they just got flamed. There were these people who would write in with these, really kind of silly and outrageous screen names, and just ripped them apart. I mean, it was personal. It was oftentimes ill-informed, really just highly inflammatory discourse. So one of the students came back the next day and said, "Have you seen what's going on with our video?" Because they were idealistic. They thought they would launch this thing, and then politicians would sit up and take notice, and all of a sudden everybody would start with productive dialogue. But so we read them in class because not everyone had seen them, and the more we went through them, the more they saw some interesting things, like the people who were really writing the highly charged stuff were not all that informed themselves. There was a lot of just things being written just to get reaction. But anyway, my question to them was, well, should we delete these comments? Because really they're insulting, and a lot of them. And they said, no, we think those things should stay on there as part of the public discourse, just to show more of, here's exactly what we're talking about, like this is the problem with discourse today. So, that was what, Ellen, when you mentioned some of this kind of behavior earlier about people, getting flamed and that kind of stuff, and then Shawn, with your idea of the public nature, that example really came to mind.
Yeah, I just want to say how excited I am to hear what you're doing around that, Chris, because, participatory media gives young people a lot of opportunity, and I think just refraining from participating in heated discussions is just going to create an overall silencing. But having those discussions of how do you deal with it and getting those supports, which kids aren't getting right now very much according to at least our survey data, I think having some of those models emerge of how to teach young people to really deal with and experience that is so critical. And I wanted to chime in on what Shawn was saying, because one of the things that stood out to me that I think resonates with our project in Oakland is the idea of having sort of lower and higher stakes versions of being public, so both for the students and for the teachers. So a lot of teachers, it's a big step to get their students' voices out there. They think they have to create a whole video project or do something major, when really having their kids participate even within the classroom, commenting on each other's stuff, is actually fairly new and feels higher stakes, at least from the students I'm interviewing. They feel like they're actually doing something that's being seen by their peers and has a slightly higher stakes than if they were just turning in a paper to the teacher. And so we're seeing that's a really meaningful shift for students from business as usual, even if it's not, speaking to an authentic audience of 40,000 people. I
was going to mention that we had a conversation with our Student Reporting Labs network this was about online privacy, and it basically just what are your expectations when you go online and post on Facebook and Twitter, your privacy. We kind of combined that with like what was going on with the NSA. And it was really interesting what the students said about, yeah, well, we feel like we've given up all our rights and we don't read the contracts when we sign on to these platforms, so we deserve whatever we get. That was a little disturbing. But then they were also kind of begging for teachers and schools to talk about social media and to have them in a classroom setting or a place that's where they feel like there's an adult in the room who's kind of helping them also think through these things, talk about chat boards and discussion groups and the cyberbullying that goes on. But they were really asking for just a regular conversation about these things, which I thought was really interesting, and it shows a real need for both the teacher training and the resources so that those conversations are commonplace.
I'd like to speak a little bit more about the idea of leveling those conversations. I found that because the nature of social media use for students is very informal, that when we get into some of these more formal settings, I found that, especially with freshmen, where I really wanted them to engage, or younger students, to engage in the conversation, they would oftentimes be a little bit uncomfortable with it too. So by creating private discussion boards through tools like Schoology, or having them post their work on blogs where they can start to address in a smaller level the kind of interaction, was a way that I could get students more comfortable. And many of them are eager to jump right in, and they're very comfortable, but sometimes they're using very informal norms for how they respond to people and the way that they comment back. So I think that the world of social media has, in a very real way, the norms have been created by younger people, and they have established when it's okay to discuss and yell back and get upset. And I think it is incumbent upon teachers to, as much as we can, demonstrate the appropriate way to interact in these situations and give them a framework for how to break down a crisis when it happens. This person has said this. I liked when when Chris was talking about, you read those comments to students and say, what should we do and what should our reaction be? And you modeled that behavior. I applaud you for actually leaving them there as an example of what exists rather than, because I think sometimes those people engage solely to be deleted, to see that they can say that something happened. But I also think it teaches our students to measure themselves and really consider their words carefully, and that's a powerful lesson for them to be learning from us.
I think related to those ideas, Shawn, excuse me, is a question from our chat. We have a couple of questions that we'll get to. One is this question that I think is related. Does anyone have examples of how they help students focus on listening, thinking, responding? And I'm wondering, I mean, I'm sure you all have thoughts on this. I'm wondering, Diana, if you have some ideas that you could share.
So one of the things that that I did with my students over the course of years, every year I ever taught, we listened to the State of the Union. It used to be back in '98 on a VHS tape, and now we've graduated to much more sophisticated ways of viewing that. But that was always something that we did that was about that listening, thinking, responding piece. And the very last year I was full-time in the classroom, I had the students kind of choose between all of these different options for social media and ways to interact when we listened to the State of the Union. And one of those options was Twitter. One of those options was Facebook. One of those options was we used Moodle, but our walled garden LMS, learning management system. And then one of them was just to take notes on paper. They also had this game. It was a bingo game. It's put up at the Constitution Center. But there was these kind of elements of play a little bit with pretty serious issues, and so they predicted what they thought they were going to hear. And then we talked a little bit about the issues of why they thought those things were going to happen. Then every kid went home with their bingo card and their preference for how they'd like to interact in the conversation in the moment. There were some kids that said, I just really want to take notes. I feel like I kind of understand what I'm going to listen to, but I can't do all of these things at once. And other kids said, I want to talk about this, but I don't want to really jam up my Twitter feed with political stuff. That's not what I do there. And other kids were just thrilled to jump into Twitter. 0 children chose Facebook. 0. Absolutely nobody wanted to go in that space for that conversation, which I thought was interesting. But there was a lot of choice about how they wanted to do that, where they wanted to do that. And so it was, a good pre-activity of what do you think you're going to hear. We talked about all the issues ad nauseum going into the event. And then in the moment, they were able to make meaning of what they were hearing while they were hearing it. What I'd found over the years was that a lot of kids would listen for a little while and then they'd get confused, or they wouldn't understand why everybody wouldn't stop clapping, or they didn't understand the pomp and circumstance of the thing and they just kind of tuned it out because it just started to become noise. And what I found by supporting them in whatever version they wanted to be supported, that they actually found a conversation and community around the ideas, and I'd have put them up against the pundits the next day. I mean, they were so well versed. It was a really interesting thing to watch that when you let them self-select in, where you kind of get them ready, and then it's very high concept in terms of, what are you listening for? What do you think were you hoping to hear? What did you hear? But it's all in the moment, and so it was an incredibly powerful learning experience. And every year on Facebook, I will have kids chime in with, I'm watching again, and not because I have to, but because I want to, and here's what I'm hearing, and they'll re-engage me in that conversation years later. And so I found that a really interesting activity for that.
That's really interesting. One of the activities that we have in our Student Reporting Labs curriculum, because we are sending the students out into their community to interview adults, right? They have to go interview a scientist about where their water comes from, or we've had kids go out and interview. We had Chris, a student in Connecticut, go and interview their governor about gun control, basically. So these kids have to be prepared for that experience of going out and talking to an adult on camera. And so we have a couple of listening exercises within the curriculum, and they role model and they map out the interview, and they practice follow-up questions and kind of telling back to themselves the information they just heard and what did they not understand and what did they not hear. And it's such a powerful experience of going out and doing that kind of interview, and they get better at it, and they come back and they're all disappointed with themselves because they didn't ask that question or they didn't follow up. But I think that that's such a powerful form of learning that will affect, hopefully, the other topics and the other times in their academic careers where they're going to have to listen to someone speak and then figure out what the person didn't say, and then follow up and try to figure out exactly what the messaging is that someone's trying to give them in an interview, or as you said, in a speech, or other forms of media.
And I'm wondering, so as educators, as you're engaging your young people in social media, are there concerns raised by parents and guardians as your young people are doing this work? And if so, how do you address those concerns?
I think the easiest way that I've been able to express those concerns to parents when they arise is to include them in the conversation and to listen to what they say. A lot of my parents were really concerned when I said that I was going to start using social media. When the Arab Spring events were happening several years ago, we started listening to what was going on in Tahrir Square, and we were actually listening to individual voices in the crowd in Tahrir Square and identifying bias. And we had my students listening for the sides and trying to identify perspectives and trying to formulate how a person can see the world in a particular way. And when parents heard of that, I got a few phone calls because Twitter was relatively new to them, and we had to demonstrate to them what they were seeing and just kind of reassure the parents that we were processing what's going on and helping the students to understand all of the different perspectives that are out there, not just throwing them into an uncharted sea of information and messages. And so by listening and talking to them and not just kind of putting it aside, I think I won parents over. I haven't had a single complaint about social media use in the last 3 years, partially because it's something that they're familiar with and I have a reputation for doing it. And I think that was achieved by engaging with what parents said and not dismissing their fears, because they're real to them.
Wonderful. Thanks, Shawn. And I think related to this is a question that came up in our chat, which is, are there any recommendations for helping students navigate between personal versus classroom / professional social media discussions? I think that's such a great question, because we both want to leverage what our young people are able to do and the spaces that they're facile with. But I think it's a tricky thing, even for me as an adult, being able to navigate that distinction between the professional and the personal. So thoughts on that?
I can make a quick plug for just the necessity of thinking about that. Emily Weinstein, a colleague with Project Zero, interviewing politically active youth, really identified this as a challenge for a lot of young people, thinking about how much they want to blend their personal and their political identities and thinking about that. So it's something they're really grappling with, and so opportunities to really talk through. So I posted the link for that article. I would highly recommend it to people.
Yeah, I had a lot of range of response. So we do the KQED Do Now thing, and so I give students the choice every week. They can be responding on the blog or they can tweet it. And so interesting conversation about how some of the people were, some of the students were, I don't know if upset is the right word, but they were kind of chagrined that, like their friends were saying, like, what's the deal with you tweeting out this current event stuff when usually you're just tweeting out like sports stuff or just like whatever, so then there was this weird kind of thing where they were like, I don't know, like I might just ditch the whole Twitter thing. Some of them said no, that represents my whole package, like I'm interested in this stuff. I'm also interested in music, and so it's all part of the mosaic, that is me on Twitter. Some of them deleted Twitter accounts altogether, which was interesting, and then they started over with a new one. And so there was this really wide range of accepting this academic kind of political, well, it was, I guess I'll leave it at academic, into their kind of social persona, and they were grappling with that.
That's fascinating. And Diana, are you, is there a, I believe you have a resource that you wanted to make known to the audience that can help respond to this kind of question?
Yeah, I was just referring to the resources from Common Sense Media, which someone in the chat had posted before I could even get over there. That's how spot on that resource was. And so they have a lot of really wonderful practical tools to kind of help both on the parent side and the student side. You know, kind of how to navigate some of this space between the professional and the personal. The other thing that I would put a plug in for is that at SLA, what we had done was that each of the students maintained a blog with their academic work, and the kids really understood what the difference was between their day-to-day work that was inside the LMS versus what they put out on their blog, that it was their polished, finished work. And just having that kind of interaction with them about, oh, this is what it looks like when I'm publishing versus this is what it looks like when I'm just working on something, and kind of delineating those spaces is interesting. And it's also, when you Google the kid's name, it is the first thing that will populate for every kid, which is their academic profile or portfolio or whatever word you want to use. It's a blog, but it's basically, this is what I did as a student. And that's been a very powerful thing to have that. They understand that managing their search of who they are as a, you know, as a learner as they go into a collegiate setting and also in the workplace is really important. And you know, so that's kind of an interesting space to kind of navigate. And then the other thing that I'll point out is that many of the teachers at SLA are inside the social spaces with the kids. You know, we have a pretty, you know, simple policy, which is we don't ever engage in friending someone or, you know, that whole scene. But if a student wants to invite us into that, that's our choice if we want to go into that space. But it's an interesting thing to be able to work with kids on. You know, we watch conversations some nights and kind of back channel it, like, should someone step in or not, and kind of watch them navigate this space. And sometimes kids will come to us, you know, in private message and be like, something's kind of getting out of control over there on Facebook. Could one of you jump in and help kind of rein that thing back in, because they know it needs to happen, but they don't really understand how to. And so, you know, some people don't feel comfortable with teachers and adults being in those spaces with kids, but we've found it to be one of the most effective ways to help students develop the type of responsible, engaging kinds of skills that we want them to exhibit on their own, is to be in there with them and not telling them what to do, but just really kind of being in that advisory role to kind of guide and watch what's going on.
Great. And what that makes me think of, Diana, is our notions of identity that I think come up as we ask kids to engage in social media and online spaces. And then I know, Ellen, that you and I have had conversations about this very topic over the years, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts on this question of identity.
Yeah, I was really enjoying a lot of what Diana had to say, actually, because I think, you know, left to their own devices, young people spend a lot of time developing their social identities and their recreational identities, and at times identities around things they're interested in. And civic education is really about having times to explore and establish your civic identity. What's your role in public life? How do you put yourself out there as part of the group? And so I really like the idea of thinking about, okay, what's the first search that what comes up about you when people search? What have you said publicly? And having, you know, that they have both the ability and the right to have a real public voice and public presence. And so to me, it just seems like a really critical piece, and particularly for youth in urban environments where their voices aren't frequently represented. And so for people to see what they have to say, and that they have important things to say, and that they have points of connection, I think can be a really powerful tool.
I think once they see those profiles in action, that's a really great learning time for them too, because we have the students, if they're going to reach out to someone to ask for an interview, we have them first go to that that person's Twitter feed and kind of look over who this person is in social media. And then they know that they're going to try to reach out to them via social media through their Twitter handle. So like, well, go back and look, if that, you know, expert in XYZ is going to look at your Twitter feed, what are they going to see? And sometimes the students are horrified and they start deleting, as you said, or sometimes they then look for their school's news Twitter feed, and they'll say, okay, well, we'll approach them through this Twitter handle. And so they start to differentiate which handles you use for what, and what kind of platforms. Do you use Facebook? Do you use Twitter? They've also used some other platforms that they're just more naturally on, and each time they get to see how people represent themselves, and think about more their future and how they're going to look in 10 years. And so we have kids realize, okay, I have to take down those like half-naked pictures of myself, because if I'm going to engage with adults, and eventually, they start to make those connections. I'm going to engage with adults now. Pretty soon I'm going to be applying to colleges. Then I'm going to be applying for jobs, and they start to visualize that future and what they're creating now, and how that's going to affect what they're able to do in the future.
Speaking of the future, Leah, I want to go back to a question that was posed in the chat, pretty early on, and that question is, creating videos gives my students a voice that they didn't have in the past. They can create a PSA on a timely topic. What do you think student connection in class will look like in 5 or 10 years? Where is this all headed? Shawn, would you like to jump in on this question?
Sure. I think that, just from when Diana was talking earlier about how things have changed from when she started teaching to now, I think similarly back to being a social studies teacher, I think about these seminal events that have happened in history. And for me, one of them was when the first space shuttle blew up. And I was crushed. I was such a romantic lover of the space program, and I heard about it at school. I went to the library to watch moments of TV on it. And so I remember going home and watching the news and then having a series of hours when there would be no broadcast on it, so I could interact with my parents. They could process for me. I could have a discussion with people and make sense of it. Then I watched the news at 10. I was free from it again until the following morning. And again, I could process it with my parents. But when the Boston bombings happened recently, I found out about it in my car from students who were tweeting at me. I got over 30 different tweets focused towards me, or "You've got to see this, Mr. McCusker. What do I make of this?" By the time I had driven 35 minutes home, I had one student who had identified a false tweet that was factually inaccurate. And so my students were processing all that information. And I think that in the future, what will change is the ubiquity of these conversations, that they won't be something that you necessarily have to go to. I think they're going to be happening constantly. And that, like, we comment on the work that we do. And even through work, a lot of the work that I do right now happens through Google+. And I share content, and it's commented on at every level. And the work that we do is going to be more obvious. So I think that what's important for us is to help students understand, as many people have said, like the reach of their message and how that message is tied into their identity and how it interacts with their futures. Like, you're going to have a job at some point. Everything you put out on Twitter, people can find. There was an article about a company who specializes in identifying deleted content from social media accounts for students, or for people when they go to a job. So not just what did you put out, but what did you delete? And can they find it to see what was it that you put out that you later thought better of? And so that raised some conversation in my class with my students. I think it's us trying to prepare them for a much more consistent and ubiquitous conversation taking place in our lives.
Yeah, I started thinking about, like, the question is about the future, and it's not always easy to predict the future. But if the one thing that's not going to change that I think is really one of the reasons I participate in the Do Now is that students need to have this background knowledge to enter into civic discourse, right? And so where does that come from? Well, one of the things I noticed with the Do Now is that things will kind of loop. So there'll be a post on, let's say, the minimum wage, should it be raised or not. Then maybe a couple months down the road there'll be something on homelessness or that kind of thing. So what I found was that students started using the evidence from some of their earlier postings to feed into other kinds of issues that are obviously related. And so the big thing I think that is never going to change is that we need to help them make those connections and build the background knowledge so that they can form the schema in their brains to be able to participate coherently, knowledgeably, that kind of thing. And I'm, if I could guess the future, I'm sure they're going to come out with more polished, HD, prettier products that we have now, and they'll, control their, their look maybe a little bit better. But that's the thing that I notice, it's never going to change, is that how do we develop that knowledge? And Ellen, I'm sure you, and Leah, you probably have a lot to say about how you help people do that. But that's the thing that I think is just crucial, and it happens through repeated exposure to these kinds of public media coming into our classrooms to help us teach the kids.
Great, thanks. How wonderful. We even have a crystal ball here in this webinar. I love it. So one thing that I at least am curious about, I don't know if anyone else is, but I'll pose this question on my own behalf, which is I think sometimes we can make the assumption that engaging in civic discourse is the same thing as engaging or essentially taking part in some sort of civic engagement activity, and that may very well be true, but I'm wondering what is the relationship really between civic discourse and civic engagement? If someone would like to take that on.
I can jump in on that one. So one of the things that I think that somehow has gotten a bit confused is that participating in a hashtag has somehow become civic engagement. And while it can be, it is certainly one of 100 ways that people can actually participate in what is going on around them. I also think that an interesting kind of tension is that, much like with elections, we somehow get a little bit more enamored by things happening nationally and internationally and forget about what's happening locally. And so as people kind of turn to social media and you lose the boundaries of the geography, sometimes the civic engagement, they think that by concerning themselves just with things that are national or international, they kind of lose some of that in some interesting ways, and forget about what's happening next door in the neighborhood next to them, or things that they could be doing locally. And so I was always really cognizant of both trying to engage them with the social media in ways that they can use technology to kind of leverage those spaces, but also to do it where they actually live, and how important that is. And then the other thing that I just kind of, going back to the future thing, not to make a movie reference, but the one thing that keeps recurring over and over and over and over and over and over when people say, what's it going to be like 5 years from now? The thing, I basically say we're never done again, ever. Like, there's no end to this thing. We're just in an iterative process over and over and over again. And one of the things that we need to be really cognizant of is the resiliency of both ourselves and our students to process through these spaces with us. And one of the real big challenges to that, Shawn referenced, is kind of that information overload, or the constant negative that can possibly, with news, I'm kind of glad that I'm not teaching right now. I mean, the last week it would be like a really challenging thing to sit through a class with every day. One of my 7th graders last year, I said, okay, let's talk about the news, and he looked at me and he said, can we just talk about happy things today? And he really meant it. It was something that was almost too much for him on a daily basis to just continue consuming. And so both for the teachers and the students, how are we going to stay resilient over the next 5 years to be in a place where we're still taking advantage of all of these really wonderful and interesting opportunities, and don't burn ourselves out on all of the information all of the time, and really have a way to process that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, so when I think about, I come to youth civic engagement from an early sort of around the turn of the millennium concerns about whether young people are engaged in politics. And the way I define civic engagement is working to define and address issues of public concerns. I think so often we focus on the voting, which is the addressing, and not on the definition of public issues. And so, what you hear from young people is, my issues aren't being represented. Why should I pay attention to what politicians are doing? So getting your issues out there happens through things like civic discourse. So learning to do that powerfully and thinking about the connection between the two, I think, is critical, both for young people to understand not everyone agrees with them, and also to get their perspectives out there and to deepen their content knowledge and background knowledge of the issues through discussion.
Yeah, I was going to add, that's why we really focus on the storytelling, and so having the students become effective storytellers and message makers, because if they're able to craft something, in our case, video, but we're definitely, we're working with the National Writing Project, we also want to get really powerful students. We work on their text stories, and we try to, tell them how to pull out those details and be engaging and be descriptive. That's so important, because if you're able to tell a story in that way and then put it out on social media and then have a really positive experience, we've had a lot of kids, their stories have kind of been replayed, or they've gotten local press coverage, or they've been part of an event at their local PBS station. I mean, if you kind of celebrate them for being their storytellers and creating these, like telling these unique these news events from their unique perspective, I think that's the most powerful way to show that civic engagement is worth it, and you can, you'll be recognized for your voice, and you can have a positive impact.
Wonderful. Would anyone else like to add to this? Otherwise, I'll move on. All right. Well, so we are getting close to the top of the hour. I hate to cut off this conversation because it has been incredibly generative, and I've really appreciated all your perspectives. I'm wondering, in these last few minutes, because there's so many of you, I want to leave room for this. If you had some final thoughts to share on this topic of civic discourse and civic engagement, and the ways that social media help promote these possibilities with regard to civic discourse and civic engagement. So again, how about this time I go right to left, so we'll start with Shawn. And as well, you can, your thoughts could be about the conversation that occurred here, or some comment that was made, or some idea that was generated based on this conversation today. So let's start with you, Shawn.
There's a lot of things I want to add, but one of them that I think is important is the idea of resiliency. And having a voice that's public means being able to have people condemn, criticize, and tell you that you're wrong, and having you establish the basis for your reasoning. And in my class, we've tried to make the sources that we establish our ideas with, currency. And you can say and you can present an idea, but everyone has the right to ask you for your base information that you built that with, and the ability to share the links and the documents that we created it from. And part of the reason that we do that is so when they step out into the public view and they're sharing what they have, what they believe in, or their perspective, that when they're challenged, they can think about the constructive ideas that they put together in order to make that information valuable. But also so that they can deconstruct ideas too, because when we're creating our own thoughts, we're also taking in other people's ideas, and they need to be able to deconstruct them to see where there's fallacies and where there's weaknesses, or just there's perspective that fuels an idea. And that's the idea that keeps racing through my head here. And I know I'm probably going to go and write down some ideas for how I want to change my lessons after this conversation too. So thanks to everyone for that.
Great, thanks, Shawn. Leah?
Yeah, I would just add that I'm really, kind of inspired by all the stories that you guys have shared from your classroom, because I think those experiences are the really important thing, and that's what we're trying to do, is to support those experiences as much as possible. And we have one of the advantage of the PBS system is that there are 340 some odd stations, and we try to really use that community connection to put a mentor in the classroom, or to have the students have conversations with journalists and adults about how to use this medium as effectively as possible, and be able to have their ideas and their concerns and the stories that they feel passionately about get recognition and be part of the conversation, because that's really important for us throughout public media, but also for the NewsHour, because we want to hear, we're trying to figure out what the news of the future looks like. So this is part of an ongoing conversation with students to find out, what do you want? What will engage you? What will grip you? And that's the best way to do it, is to ask them to go out and participate and to show us what is an enticing and a compelling story for them.
Great. Thanks. Ellen?
So I just, in some of the research I've done with Joe Kahn, one of the things we're really concerned about is the ability to speak across political difference, and that's challenging for everyone. And one of the great promises of the internet is being able to find people who disagree with you easily, see things through informal conversation. But unless you really learn how to and practice really engaging with those perspectives, I don't think we're going to, I think we're going to see the opposite of sort of exacerbated differences and polarization. So, so to me, just in this moment in democracy, it's a really important thing to be talking about.
Great. Diana?
Lost you in my tab world there for a moment, sorry. So one of the big, just building on what everybody else has said, but for me it really is about getting kids to actually listen to each other and not just be all talking and all sharing, like I think this, without being able to hear and appreciate what somebody else is saying. And and this isn't new. There's nothing 21st century about the ability to both hold in your head your own opinion and accept that someone else has another one. And that, to me, is what we're losing the ability to do as kind of a collective community in the U.S. right now, is that I'm right, you're wrong seems to be kind of how this thing is breaking down so much, and students are falling into that space. And one of the things that I work so hard with kids is, you can bridge that gap and hear people and listen across it. It doesn't mean you have to believe what they believe, but it's so important to be able to still engage with them in meaningful ways, both in person, inside your community, and across social media spaces as well.
Thanks. Chris?
Yeah, to add to what Diana was just saying, I think the thing that in the end gives me hope is that our students are doing better than what we hear are their role models in Washington. It's easy to point fingers to just the political sphere, but the students are doing a much better job of understanding differences, or at least listening to differences before forming their opinions. And Diana's right. I mean, it's a constant battle that we have to do, is to make people aware of others and try to find the strongest arguments and the things that we disagree with. That's why we have great teachers, and that's why that'll never change. And so I do think, give a nod to these programs. I mean, the PBS, all your educational materials and the KQED stuff is really important for civic discourse, because more and more we don't have this common news experience anymore. We don't all read the same daily newspaper, and so that gives us the grist for knowledgeable discourse about things that really matter.
Well said, Chris. Thank you. And I will just add that in my work in the Educating for Democracy in the Digital Age project, alongside Ellen, I think one of the things that gives me hope is the fact that the educators that we work with in Oakland are really dedicated to this proposition that they want their young people to have a voice, and not only have a voice but also have an impact in the political system with knowledge and through the ability to analyze issues knowledgeably. So that is the thing that gives me hope, because in many respects, the use of these digital tools is not an easy thing. For many educators, there are many obstacles and many roadblocks in the way. And the fact that these educators are so dedicated to this notion and are willing to embark on what can be a somewhat rocky path at times, and yet come out at the other end, is the thing that I think is so remarkable. And then I would add, the other thing that gives me hope are educators like yourselves and people who are thinking about these issues and being willing to provide the kinds of resources that you do and engage in the kinds of conversations and discourse yourself that you have done today. So just want to extend a huge thank you to you, and I'll just close out with a couple of, to each and every one of you, and I'll just close out with a few logistical points here. This, of course, wraps up our fourth webinar of the Teach Do Now course, but that doesn't mean, excuse me, that the conversations have to pause. We encourage everyone who is in the audience to keep the energy going by using the Twitter hashtag #TeachDoNow and by getting involved in the ongoing conversations within the Teach Do Now Google+ community. We have a new Do Now prompt that you should take a look at and continue to discuss. And then mark your calendars for Monday, August 4th at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern for the fifth webinar in the series. To learn more about Educator Innovator, the host for this webinar, and its network of partners, please check out educatorinnovator.org. And for more information about connected learning activities, and connected learning is embedded in this Teach Do Now MOOC, happening this summer, check out www.makesummer.org and as well clalliance.org. If you're interested in learning more about the Do Now working group in the fall or want to join, please visit kqed.org/donow and scroll down to apply to the KQED Do Now working group for fall 2014. That's it for now. Thanks to all our guests. A huge thank you to you in the audience, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.